Not really. I'm just gonna move it closer for my, there we go, I was gonna say for my sake and for Julie's. Okay. Good afternoon. We're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm Nancy Kirkpatrick. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at Smith College. And it is a pleasure to welcome those of you who are in the room and those of you who are online to this special program, which is generously supported by the Friends of Smith College Libraries and the Oculus Society. Today, we are delighted to host an alumni, Julie Dobrow, who returns to Smith to share her work on love and loss after Wounded Knee, exploring the remarkable lives of Elaine Goodale and Charles Eastman, an extraordinary story of love, history, and resilience. And I will leave it to Mari to give you more of an introduction. But the last thing I wanted to say, besides thank you for being here, is to read the college's land acknowledgement statement. Smith College acknowledges and appreciates that the space in which we gather today is built within Nonotuck ancestral homelands. We recognize our present-day neighboring Indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan, Pequot, and Narragansett to the south, the Mohican and Mohawk to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. Finally, we acknowledge and celebrate the presence of Indigenous people here among us today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mari.
Hello, all. Good volume. Okay. My name is Mariana Brandman, Mari, and I'm the Sophia Smith Collection Archivist here at Smith College Special Collections. Today, it's my privilege to welcome scholar and author Julie Dobrow back not only to one of her archives for Love and Loss After Wounded Knee, but also her own alma mater. Julie Dobrow earned her AB from Smith College in anthropology and sociology, and earned her master's and PhD degrees in media studies from the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. There, her research focused on the social implications of technology use and the effects of gender, race, and ethnic portrayals in the media. She holds faculty appointments, and bear with me here, there's a lot. She holds faculty appointments as Distinguished Senior Lecturer in the Elliott Pearson Department of Child Study and Human Development, the Film and Media Studies Program, and the Civic Studies Program in Tufts Schools of Arts and Sciences, as well as the Department of Public Health and Community Medicine at the Tufts Medical School. She also serves as a senior fellow in media and civic engagement at the Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts. Julie's other research interests lay in women's history and communication studies, as well as biography. She is co-principal founder and producer of the Half the History Project, a multimodal project that uses short-form biography, film, and podcast to tell the untold and undertold stories of women's lives. Julie's 2018 book, After Emily, Two Remarkable Women and the Legacy of America's Greatest Poet, was a dual biography of Mabel Loomis Todd and Millicent Todd Bingham, the two women most responsible for Emily Dickinson's initial posthumous publication. Her upcoming book project, tentatively titled Concord's Old Manse, A Biography of a House, focuses on the remarkable women who lived in the shadows of the more prominent male residents of the home. Julie serves on the steering committee of the New England Biography Series for the Massachusetts Historical Society, the board of the Lincoln Historical Society, and she is president of the Boston Authors Club. Published last year by NYU Press, Love and Loss After Wounded Knee, a biography of an extraordinary interracial marriage, tells the complicated story of Elaine and Charles Eastman's lives and the ways in which their relationship was emblematic of the seismic changes in gender, race, and Indigenous identity during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Julie first discovered them while a student at Smith, working in the Eastman, Goodale, Dayton family papers, a collection here in Special Collections, donated by Elaine Goodale Eastman herself. And Julie remained intrigued by their experiences until she was able to devote herself fully to producing this evocative and deeply researched biography. Now, one quick bit of housekeeping. We're excited to hear the questions that Julie's talk elicits from the audience today. And to those of you who are attending via Zoom, please submit your questions using the Q&A function, and we'll include them alongside those in the room during the Q&A. Okay, and with that, please everyone join me in welcoming Julie Dobrow.
Thanks, Mari, for that lovely introduction. And Nancy Kirkpatrick, I want to thank you as well. And special shout out to Mary Irwin and the Friends of the Smith College Library for inviting me today to talk about my new book, Love and Loss After Wounded Knee. I am always excited to have an opportunity to talk about Elaine Goodale and Ohiyé Sá, or Charles Alexander Eastman, because honestly, they have been a part of my life for a very, very long time. It was actually the summer before my senior year here at Smith College when I had a job in the Sophia Smith Women's History Archive. And part of what I was tasked with that summer was sorting through a new tranche of papers that the archive had received. As I organized and read through the old yellowed newspaper clippings and letters, the photographs that were curling up at the edges, an amazing story literally leapt off the pages. I found this story to be so incredibly compelling, so much so that I decided to write my senior thesis about it. I was also very much inspired by former Smith College president, Jill Kerr Conway, who spoke often about women's history and why it is so important to find new ways of telling it. By taking a class with Mary Elizabeth Murdoch, the former director of the Sophia Smith Collection, who spoke so eloquently about the kinds of sources that exist and usually about most of the sources that don't for women's history. By the late Professor Neil Salisbury, whose courses on Native American history taught me that there are different ways to center and tell Indigenous stories. And of course, by my wonderful sociology advisor, Peter Rose, whose approach to telling the stories of marginalized peoples and the strangers in our midst really showed me that it is important to center those whose voices have been socially, culturally, and politically oppressed. And I have to say, I'm feeling so blessed to have Peter and Hetty Rose here with us this afternoon. Actually, it really feels like old home week to me with a lot of people I know from different parts of my life here. So thank you all for coming. I would say, though, that even after doing a reasonably deep dive into the Eastmans back when I was a Smith College student, I felt that I was not done with them, not quite yet. Fast forward several decades later, after Emily, my first biography of Mabel Loomis Todd and Millicent Todd Bingham, I was searching around for who would become the subject of my second biography. And despite the advice of my then editor and then agent that my second biography should be about someone more famous, I kept finding myself drawn back to Elaine and Charles Eastman. They were very well known in their own day, but today, not so much. And yet, I felt that they should be. I felt that their story was fascinating. I felt the draw of their lives every bit as much as I did when I first stumbled on it. You can imagine the kind of full circle moment I felt back in 2022 when I returned here to the beautifully renovated Nielsen Library to do some research. And especially when, much to my surprise, I found my own handwriting still on some of the envelopes containing documents that I had sorted long ago when I first discovered the Eastmans. So what I'd like to do this afternoon is to whet your appetite a bit for this incredible story. I think you'll see why the Eastmans have stuck with me for so many years. And also why, although this is a story that began in the 19th century, it is very much a story for the present. And in America, where once again, there is much debate and dissension over who is and who might become an American. Now, part of what I found so amazing about the Eastmans is that, like so many star-crossed lovers, it was extremely unlikely that they ever would have met in the first place. And also, like so many star-crossed lovers, theirs was a love that was thwarted by outside forces and by fate, in addition to interpersonal issues. But the outside forces that impeded upon Elaine and Charles are also noteworthy because they included the issues swirling around about race, gender, and Indigenous identity in an America that was rapidly changing in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And finally, I think the Eastman story is an important one because they move back and forth across the country a lot. Charles and Elaine's journeys into and out of Indian country, as symbolic as they were actual, represented a vision of a Native America and of a United States of America, familiar but unknown, entwined yet separated, inextricable yet never fully joined, just like Elaine and Charles themselves. Now, the first thing that you need to know about Charles Eastman is that, like many Dakota, he went by different names at different points in his life. As his biographer, I've come to believe that what he called himself at any given time is also an insight into what was going on in his life. Hakada, as he was originally known, was born in 1858, somewhere near Redwood Falls, Minnesota, about 116 miles west of present-day Minneapolis. But like so much else about his life, there is little documentation of his early years. We do know that his mother, Mary Nancy Eastman, or Winona, was the only child to come from the union of Wakan Izinwin, stand sacred, a Dakota daughter of the chief Cloudman, who was one of the earliest Sioux to convert to Christianity, and Captain Seth Eastman, a West Point-trained U.S. Army officer and artist stationed in Minnesota. Captain Eastman would later desert his daughter and her mother for a white woman, also named Mary, whom he also married. And this was not an uncommon practice among white military men at the time. Winona, herself raised with the Wahpeton Santee Dakota, married a man named Many Lightnings, and together they had 5 children, of whom Charles was the youngest. Sadly, she died shortly after his birth, leaving his relatives to name him Hakada, or the pitiful last, and to raise him. The early tragedies of Hakada's life continued. By the late 1850s, the Minnesota Territory filled with more than 150,000 white settlers. It would become an official U.S. state in 1858, the same year that Hakata was born. As white America pushed its boundaries with new westward expansion routes, the Sioux became increasingly embroiled in controversies as their land was increasingly compromised or taken over. Tensions rose, skirmishes erupted, and by 1862, what's variously known as the Sioux Uprising or the Dakota War began, with white troops advancing on Dakota villages and shooting indiscriminately. Hakata fled along with his grandmother, uncle, and other relatives. His father and brother were believed to have been captured and killed by the Army in the largest mass execution in American history depicted on this slide. Hakata and his remaining family fled north to Manitoba, where he grew up through his adolescence. It was at this time that he took on his second name, Ohiyé Sá, or the winner, so named because of his athletic prowess. In about 1873, when he was 15, Ohiyé Sá was shocked to discover that his father and brothers were, in fact, still alive. They had been incarcerated, not killed. During their imprisonment, they had converted to Christianity, and his father, now calling himself Jacob Eastman, had come to reclaim his youngest son and bring him back to Flandreau, South Dakota, where he had a farm. Jacob now believed that the only way forward for Native Americans was to become as Americanized as possible, including receiving a Westernized education. And so Ohiyé Sá took on his third name, Charles Alexander Eastman. He became a Christian, he cut his hair, and embarked on a series of day, boarding, and preparatory schools at which he excelled. 1,800 miles away, and a decade earlier, in October of 1863, Elaine Goodale was born in the tiny remote village of Mount Washington, Massachusetts, in the southwesternmost corner of the Berkshires. Her childhood was spent wandering the fields and mountains near her home, along with her 3 siblings. They were homeschooled by their mother at the elegiacally named Sky Farm. Even today, where you can only see the ruins of the barn, it's clear that this is a magical place where the fields meet the sky as the mists lift off the mountains. Elaine and her younger sister, Dora, showed an unusual and early facility with words. By the time she was 13 years old, Elaine had already had numerous poems published in the widely circulated St. Nicholas magazine. By the time she was 15, her poetry had been published in a book, Apple Blossoms, that garnered much critical acclaim, sold 10,000 copies, went through 5 editions, and generated a lot of what today we would call buzz. By the time she was 18, Elaine had already authored or co-authored 5 books of poetry and essays. She was widely known as one of the childhood poetic prodigies of the Berkshires. But being called a childhood poetic prodigy only went so far, and it was certainly no guarantee of being able to support oneself, especially not if the poetic prodigy was female. And so, like many other educated women of her era who had extremely limited career options, Elaine became a teacher. Only rather than teach in the little one-room schoolhouse in Mount Washington, Elaine elected to travel to Virginia, where the dashing General Samuel Chapman Armstrong had started the Hampton Institute to teach newly emancipated Black children, and then a decade later, Native American children. Armstrong fully subscribed to the idea circulating in 19th century America that the best possible thing for anyone who wasn't white was to try to become as much like white people as possible, with the very big caveat that it was also widely believed that any person of color could never fully be as advanced as people who were white. And of course, today we know that boarding schools like Hampton not only tried to assimilate the children who were there, but did so by tearing them away from their families, their communities, and their cultures, often with very tragic results. Elaine fell in love with her Native American students. She began learning their languages, believing that a bilingual education would be more helpful. And she traveled to the Dakota Territory in 1884, undaunted by society's admonitions. She wanted to see where her students came from in a quest to better understand them. While there, she also began to formulate her idea that education for these students would be far more impactful if it were to happen within their communities. She pitched this idea to General Armstrong and eventually procured the funds to open her own day school in White River, Dakota Territory. At this time, Elaine also turned from poetry to prose and documented much of what she was doing and much of what she saw in articles that were published in all of the leading newspapers and magazines of the era. Her high-profile voice on Indian issues and education eventually led to her appointment as the first supervisor of education for the newly separated states of North and South Dakota. Now, while Elaine was busy getting experience with Native Americans by teaching, Charles was busy getting experience with Euro-Americans by studying in a series of schools that eventually landed him at Dartmouth College, where he was the only Native student in his class. He quickly distinguished himself as a star athlete and would often be labeled by the college Dartmouth's Indian as his later professional reputation grew. He would often return to Dartmouth reunions in full Sioux regalia and sat for 2 portraits that are today in the Hood Museum. Charles's early unusual educational attainment, his great facility in speaking, and quite frankly, his very good looks, meant that he was often featured in the press of the day. This coverage, however, was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it meant that Charles became widely known in his time, one of the most prominent and easily recognizable Native Americans of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But on the other hand, the coverage that he received was often highly stereotyped and filled with misinformation of all kinds. Wanting to find ways to parlay his education into something helpful for his people, Charles was initially torn between legal and medical training after college, but opted to attend the Boston University School of Medicine, where once again, he was the only Indigenous person in his class, hailed by his white mentors as the epitome of an assimilated Indian, the very model for what a Euro-American education could do. Upon his graduation, Charles accepted a job with the government and returned to South Dakota, traveling to Pine Ridge as the agency physician. As Charles traveled back to South Dakota, and as Elaine traveled around the states visiting schools, the conditions for Native Americans steadily deteriorated. White settlers had poured into the West, and the US government continued to claim lands for themselves and push Indigenous people onto ever smaller reservations. Railroads exacerbated the emigration and put increasing environmental pressures on the land. The mass slaughter of bison irrevocably changed the ways in which the Lakota and other Great Plains tribes lived, and the US government tried to insist that they adopt agricultural practices not well suited for the land. Euro-Americans introduced diseases heretofore unknown to Indigenous people. The US Indian Service was also rife with grifters and unethical, poorly trained people who had neither knowledge of nor much sympathy for the Native peoples that they were overseeing. The Lakota, as well as other tribal groups, became wards of a state that they never sought to be part of. Illness and poverty were rampant, and the assimilation policies of the US government were making disastrous incursions in the Indigenous cultures and ways of life. In response to the increasingly desperate situation, many tribes began adopting the ghost dance, a ceremony that they believed would connect them with their dearly departed, bring back the buffalo and the old ways of life, and rid them of the unwanted and unwelcome Euro-American insistence on changing Indigenous practices. Large numbers of Indigenous people would gather together, paint their bodies, go into ritual sweat lodges, sing and dance. But Euro-Americans did not understand the ghost dance for what it was. They did not see it as a reclamation of traditions, but rather as a threat, and they called in the troops. By 1876, the Army had already deployed more than 15,000 soldiers in the Great Plains. By December of 1890 in Pine Ridge, there were an additional 5,000 troops, with another 4,000 or so in adjacent areas, which was fully 1/3 of the US Army at the time. It was the single largest deployment of the military since the Civil War. And all of this, all of it, was covered in great detail by the press, who, sniffing a story about to unfold, crowded into the frontier towns adjacent to reservations. And then, in the middle of all of these rising tensions, Elaine Goodale traveled to Pine Ridge. She was invited to a tea party by the local rector and his wife, and it was there that she met the handsome young doctor that everyone was talking about. Their connection was instant and it was compelling. I had laid my plans carefully and purposed to serve my race for a few years in my profession, and I had decided that it would not be wise to think of marriage for the present, wrote Charles. However, I had not given due weight to the possibility of love. When, only a few weeks after our meeting, I promised to marry Dr. Eastman, it was with a thrilling sense of twofold consecration, recalled Elaine. I gave myself wholly in that hour. At the same time, I embraced with a new and deeper zeal the conception of lifelong service to my husband's people. After just 3 weeks, these two young people who had come from such different worlds became engaged in front of the Christmas tree. But just 4 days after that, their whole world was turned upside down. Elaine and Charles heard the booming sounds of the Hotchkiss rifles at nearby Wounded Knee Creek. After it was over, more than 250 Lakota men, women, and children had been killed, most of them unarmed, often shot at point-blank range, and many of them miles from the site of the mass killing. The 7th U.S. Cavalry, George Armstrong Custer's old unit, was responsible for the carnage, making it one of the largest mass killings in American history. Charles's BU medical school training had not prepared him for this type of mass casualty situation, but he valiantly tried to save as many people as he could. Elaine worked by his side, called into service as a nurse. This incredibly traumatic event marked a turning point in U.S.-Indian relations. Writes historian David Martinez, Wounded Knee signaled the abrupt transformation of Indian nations from geopolitical powers to symbols of conquest. Wounded Knee also marked a turning point in Elaine and Charles's relationship. Just 6 months later, and much against the wishes of her family, Elaine and Charles were married in New York City. They were a very rare interracial couple, rarer still because there were many more marriages between Native women and white men than the other way around. The combination of this fact and their respective early high profiles in the press meant that their wedding was covered in more than 200 newspapers, coast to coast in the United States and even in newspapers abroad. Coverage of Elaine and Charles in the press often emphasized the differences in their backgrounds, usually describing him in highly racialized and stereotypical ways. For instance, the Watertown Times in New York proclaimed, "Poetess marries big Injun." The San Francisco Chronicle ran a front-page story declaring, "Fair bride of an Indian, Elaine Goodale weds the red man of her choice." Sometimes articles focused on Charles's educational background, often misrepresenting it by suggesting that he had gone to school at Cornell or Harvard or Yale. He was referred to as a specimen with racialized language discussing his physical attributes. Quote, "He is of medium height with all the peculiarities of his people in his features. His eyes are small and glittering. Whoops. His face and nose are broad, and his cheekbones very pronounced, according to an article in a California newspaper. And we lost our PowerPoint. Here we go. This type of media coverage, highlighting the differences between Elaine and Charles's backgrounds while pointedly describing Charles in stereotyped ways, would dog them throughout their marriage. After Wounded Knee, both Elaine and Charles concluded that they could no longer work for the US government. I think we're okay. So they packed up their meager belongings along with their new baby daughter, and in 1893 moved to St. Paul, Minnesota. This began a series of moves that the Eastmans would make back and forth across the country, into and out of Indian country. Reflecting back on this in old age, Elaine would write to one of her sisters that, quote, Those years were a sort of endurance test. I lived in some 30 different houses in the first 20 years. In St. Paul, where Charles attempted to set up a private medical practice, he found it tough going. White patients were loath to see an Indian doctor, and Indigenous patients were reluctant to see a Native doctor who practiced Western medicine. The practice faltered and eventually failed, leaving the Eastmans without a reliable source of income. The lack of money, along with a growing family, led Elaine to encourage Charles to write out some of the stories of his childhood, which they pitched first to magazines like St. Nicholas, and then, based on the encouraging response, as an autobiographical book. Indian Boyhood, published in 1902, was a critical success. Charles then began to pivot from being a doctor to doing many other things to bring in money for the family, writing books, recruiting for the YMCA, working as an advocate for the Santee Sioux to claim funds from the US government, and many, many, many other jobs. This also led the Eastman family to move from Minnesota to Washington, D.C., back to South Dakota, and then to Pennsylvania, where both Eastmans took a job at Brigadier General Richard Henry Pratt's Carlisle Indian Industrial School. This was another famous, now infamous, boarding school where hundreds of Indigenous children were sent away from their communities and families, given an assimilatory, mostly vocational education meant to Americanize them as much as possible. Pratt would perhaps become best known for his slogan, "Kill the Indian and save the man," the epitome of his assimilationist philosophy. Charles worked as an outing agent for the Carlisle School, trying to find summer placements for Indigenous students with white families meant to give them additional vocational experience and further assimilate them to Euro-American norms. He also worked to recruit Native pupils to Carlisle. Elaine was put in charge of the school newspaper, used as an in-house news source and a way of spreading the news, read propaganda, about the school to potential donors and policymakers outside of Carlisle. It was perhaps during their relatively short time in Pennsylvania that some of the fundamental differences in Elaine and Charles's philosophies emerged. It's hard to know how Charles squared the experience of trying to Americanize and assimilate the young Indigenous people he recruited, found placements for, at the very same time that he was writing articles and books about his Indian boyhood, and realizing how foundational a part of himself that was. But it's easy to see how this must have caused some internal dissonance for him. And it's also very easy to see how this created tensions with his wife, who, while truly believing that there were aspects of Indigenous culture that were truly wonderful, also truly believed in the cult of assimilation. But this employment too proved short-lived, and soon Charles accepted yet another job as an agency physician, once again, this time at the Crow Creek Reservation in South Dakota. This job, however, was mired in problems from the start, and Charles also became mired in controversies of different sorts. By 1903, Elaine had had enough. At this point, they also had 5 children to feed and educate. Money was always very tight, and tensions between the Eastmans were growing. So, Elaine took matters into her own hands and insisted that the family move back east. They landed just down the road in Amherst, Massachusetts, where her father had rented a spacious house for them to live in. Now, for those of you who read my first book, you will love the very strange coincidence that I also love, that the first house that you see with the Amherst College under it was right next door to where Mabel and David Todd lived. This would be one of 3 different residences that Elaine, Charles, and the children lived in during the 2 decades that they lived in Amherst. Unfortunately, moving back east didn't solve all of their problems. At age 41, Elaine became pregnant again, and the Eastmans had their 6th child. Money troubles were never far away. Charles continued to publish books, and just how heavy an editorial hand Elaine had in these endeavors remains to this day a very big question. What wasn't a question was that Charles continued to take on many different jobs to earn more money, working on the so-called naming project, giving Euro-American names to Indigenous people, a US government bureaucratic effort that was steeped in controversies of all sorts and no doubt caused Charles a lot of cultural dissonance. He also worked for the Boy Scouts of America and for the Campfire Girls. He went on an expedition for the University of Pennsylvania Museum collecting Ojibwe artifacts. All of these jobs caused him to be away from Amherst more than he was there, which created additional pressures on his marriage. And then there was his burgeoning lecture career. A promotional pamphlet promised that, quote, Dr. Eastman will appear upon the platform in the full dress costume of a Sioux chief, beautifully made in the old style of beaded Indian tan deerskin with a war bonnet of eagle feathers, and that his talk would be, quote, setting forth in a fashion as convincing as it is picturesque, the truth about the much misunderstood red man. These promotional flyers stated that Charles had lectured in nearly 100 different towns and cities in New England alone. Now, honestly, this does not seem like an exaggeration to me. A 2021 electronic perusal of newspaper stories about Charles's talks between 1912 and 1920 that I did yielded hundreds of hits. He spoke before clubs and college audiences, YMCA assemblies and women's organizations. He was a featured speaker on the Chautauqua lecture circuit. He addressed politicians and book readers, Boy Scouts and Campfire Girls. Sometimes his audiences numbered a couple of dozen people, sometimes several hundred. Often, the coverage of his talks in the newspapers only reflected what he was wearing and not what he actually said. Sometimes Charles appeared in traditional Sioux regalia, and sometimes he didn't. He was probably very savvy about his appearance, knowing that it could help to increase sales and audience. But it was also probably a truer sense for him of who he actually was. And unfortunately, it was something that Elaine, his staunchly assimilationist wife, failed to recognize. She was left at home with the children. She didn't have the support she needed to continue her own writing career, and she was busy helping to try to promote Charles's. This too became a source of tension. Late in life, she would reflect, every woman who has surrendered a congenial task and financial independence will understand, she insisted as she looked back and tried to justify her choices, although she admitted, whether or not this was wise is perhaps an open question. But after the children got older, Elaine was able to do more writing, and she wrote in many different genres, including what she self-disparagingly referred to as her pot boilers, fiction not meant to be great literature, but to bring in some much-needed additional income. She would also continue to place poems in newspapers back in the days when newspapers regularly published poetry. She wrote plays, she wrote novels, she wrote books of nonfiction, and eventually she wrote a memoir that was published 2 decades after her death. But even with Elaine adding some money to the family coffers, the Eastmans were still struggling financially. Their older daughters were attending college or receiving advanced vocal training, and there were many other expenses. And then they came up with an idea to help ease their financial situation, tapping into the growing interest in the overnight summer camps. Summer camps took off in the early part of the 20th century. In 1900, there were fewer than 100 camps in the United States, but by 1918, that number had increased tenfold. Many of the camps tapped into the growing American nostalgia for simpler times through the adoption of Native American traditions like council fires, sleeping in wigwams, Indian storytelling, and Indian crafts. white Americans thought of Native Americans as temporarily outside of modernity. And if you were going to run an Indian-themed summer camp, what better marketing ploy could there be than having a camp director who actually was a Native American? Now, to be sure, Charles certainly believed that what they were doing with Camp Ohiyé and later Camp Ohiyé Sá was to impart authentic Native American practices to young white girls and boys who would benefit from learning them. But also, to be sure, the ways in which the camps were advertised leveraged simplified and often exaggerated aspects of Native American culture. It was meant for general American consumerism and commodification. The camp was successful in its first few seasons, but the summer of 1918 changed everything. After the camping season was over that fall, the influenza epidemic that had been sweeping the world began spreading in the United States. Irene Toluta, the Eastman's second oldest child, was a very talented singer. Irene might have been one of the first real crossover artists, performing both traditional Native American music, she often opened for her father's talks, as well as traditional classical Western operatic repertoire. In fact, Irene had just been accepted as part of the Metropolitan Opera in New York. She traveled up to Granite Lake in New Hampshire to tell her parents the good news, but she fell ill shortly after her arrival. And sadly, days later, Irene Toluta became one of more than at least 675,000 Americans who would die in the flu epidemic. The death of a child is an almost unthinkable tragedy that affects every member of a family. Irene's death, as it turned out, was only part of what happened between Elaine and Charles at that time. A relationship that began in the tensions building between Euro-Americans and Native Americans in the late 19th century and blossomed just ahead of the Wounded Knee Massacre, had teetered on the brink in the years afterward. It was on the precipice when Irene died, and it went over the edge with what was subsequently revealed. And that is where I'm going to leave the story this afternoon and suggest, if you want to know what happened to the Eastmans next, that you read my book. But I will end it a slightly different way. I'd like to end by reading you a short passage from the afterword of my book, in which I describe going to many of the places that the Eastmans lived and worked. As a biographer, I find that footstepping, literally going to the places that my subjects lived and worked and trying to trace their footsteps as best as I can, teaches me a lot about the people that I'm trying to know. And so I end the book with where it all began for the Eastmans, at Wounded Knee. As for Wounded Knee itself, the location that perhaps more than any other would have multifold and intense meanings for Elaine and Charles, I too found it to be an incredibly moving place. It's a place of almost mystical solemnity where the earth and sky meet upon vast horizons, and the knowledge of what happened there hangs heavily in the air. The Episcopal Church of the Holy Cross, at which the Eastmans met, declared their commitment to one another and solidified their vow to work on behalf of Indian people when they worked side by side in the church-turned makeshift hospital to try to save the victims of the Wounded Knee Massacre, was moved from its original site to Oglala, also on the Pine Ridge Reservation, in 1924. It's been rebuilt twice. The building's relative anonymity contrasts sharply with the jaggedly painful events that connect it to its past. In 1956, a large sign was erected overlooking the battlefield that described some of what occurred in 1890 and referred to it as the Battle of Wounded Knee. Sometime later, someone removed the word battle and replaced it with the more apt word, massacre. The replacement patch, a clear and visible symbol of why this word change mattered. The sign itself has been vandalized, defaced with graffiti, even shot at on numerous occasions over the years. In 1973, the marker site was the setting for the American Indian movement's occupation and protest. Historian Sherry Smith has suggested that the protest at Wounded Knee was one of the most potent reminders of the American government's broken promises to Native peoples. In 1965, the entire battlefield site was declared a U.S. National Historic Landmark and listed on the U.S. National Register of Historic Places the following year. The Wounded Knee Survivors Association, founded in the early years of the 20th century, continues to be engaged in many activities, including the repatriation of objects removed from the site of the massacre, the return of clothing stolen from the victims that landed in museums in many localities in the United States and overseas, weirdly including Barre, Massachusetts, and the protection of the Wounded Knee environment. The organization's Facebook page documents and promotes activism around this place, which serves not only as a memorial to the dead from more than a century ago, but an engagement for the living to prevent future centuries of dishonor. Across the street, high on a hill above the stark landscape, is a small cemetery with an engraved monument marking the mass grave of the Wounded Knee victims. The monument was erected in 1903 by some of the descendants of those who died. Tall brick pillars joined by a simple metal arch with a cross on it leads up to the fenced cemetery. Traditional prayer ties of different hues have been placed on some of the chain links. It's a lonely, desolate place, suffused with an ineffable sorrow, a bleak reminder of the horror that occurred there. You can't help but think of the phrase popularized by Dee Brown's best-selling 1970 book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. Many hearts are buried there. On an extremely hot day in July 2021, when the car thermometer read 107 degrees, I ascended the hill to the cemetery. I stood silently for a while before paying my own tribute to the victims by placing a small rock on a piece of the fencing, a nod to the traditional Jewish practice of honoring the dead. There was no breeze to break the sweltering temperature, no sounds to break the silence that enveloped me as completely and as searingly as the heat. I thought of how this place must have looked blanketed with snow in the blizzards of 1890 after the massacre, and how the snow would have made the Wounded Knee Valley as eerily silent then as it was on this scorching day in 2021. The anguish that this place continues to bring to the Lakota, and more generally to many Native Americans, was so clear, so poignant. Wounded Knee, perhaps more than any other site in America, embodies all of the policies and practices that not only killed more than 250 Sioux that bitterly cold and wrenchingly bitter day in December of 1890, but all of the policies and practices that have continued to marginalize Native peoples in all of the years since. The pain of the past is clearly so present. Because of this, Wounded Knee was not just a moment in time. It's a moment in which time seems to stand as still as the buttes that surround the valley. Thank you, and I'd be happy to try to answer your questions.
Testing that it's working. Okay. I'm just going to pass this around to whoever has a question.
I will answer the first question that you undoubtedly have, because I've done a number of these different questions. Look into this. And so one of the things that I'm always asked is, are there descendants? And the answer is yes. Elaine and Charles, as you know, had 6 children. 3 of their children had children. And so there are many descendants, actually. Some of them actually lived in Northampton. And sometimes people ask me, why are Elaine Goodale's papers here at Smith College? Which is a good question because she did not attend Smith College. I'll tell you another story about that in a second. But the reason that her papers are here is that two of her daughters lived in Northampton. And so Elaine had a lot of familiarity with the college. She knew that it was an institution that was dedicated to women's education. And Elaine herself really regretted her entire life that she was never able to attend college. And then the second related story that I'll tell you about this is that out in Mount Washington, where she was born, the Mount Washington Historical Society, where I'm going to be giving a talk actually this coming Saturday, put up a marker by the side of the road, which is a very lovely tribute to Elaine and her sister Dora, these childhood poetic prodigies of the Berkshires. But they got one thing wrong on their sign. They said that Elaine is a graduate of Smith College. So I've told them about this, and it is something that I think they should fix. But I will say that, speaking here about Elaine in the place that holds her papers and at the institution that she really, really wanted to go to would actually have been a very meaningful thing for her, and therefore it is also a meaningful thing to me. Oh, a familiar face here.
So first, I think that Smith can rectify that problem with the sign by giving a posthumous honorary degree to Elaine, which I think would be a good suggestion. But my question is this. I think every book is a journey, and certainly the writing of a book is a considerable journey, and the writing of this book was quite a considerable journey because it started all these years ago when you were a student at Smith College, a good 10 or 15 years ago by my calculations. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your own journey with Elaine, because that was so interesting the way, when you talk outside of this setting about your sort of like almost worshipful sense that you had of her as a young person, as you were first discovering these papers when you were a student here, and how, when you returned to this topic many years later, that became much more nuanced, and how sort of challenging that was for you to sort of have that early sense of her be challenged.
So nobody could possibly ask a more insightful question than someone who's related to me, who has probably heard about Elaine Goodale Eastman and Charles Alexander Eastman more than anybody else in this room. Well, so, I think this may be a sideways way of answering your question, but one of I had this realization recently that when I first encountered these papers of Elaine's, I was exactly the same age as she was when she went out to the Dakota Territory for the first time. And I think that for me as a 21-year-old who, although getting very good instruction in sociology, still had very little idea of what she was going to do with her life, encountering these papers and sort of seeing the story of this woman who just seemed to be so remarkably independent. She goes out west, she travels around on horseback, she decides that she's not going to wear the traditional dress of the day, and she gets rid of the petticoats and the whalebone stays and wanders around wearing moccasins and doeskin dresses, and I just thought she was so cool. I thought she was so independent, and it was something that, for me, as somebody who was really struggling a bit with my direction, I think, was something that seemed to be really inspirational. The one thing that those of you who have worked with archival papers know is that you don't always read things in order. They're not always organized in chronological ways. And I will say that today, those papers that are upstairs are so beautifully organized. But when I looked at them back in 1980, it was really a box of unsorted papers. And so I was reading things out of order. So I read these things first about Elaine going out to the Dakota Territory and sort of crafted in my mind this idealized sense of who this person was. And I thought, she's independent, she knows her own mind, she's so progressive. And then I read papers that came from later in her life, and I realized that Elaine actually fully and totally embraced an assimilationist philosophy. And I was crushed, because this wasn't the idealized image that I had had of this person. And it took me some time and, quite a lot of reading about American history and Indigenous history to understand that while there were things about Elaine Goodale that really were progressive, I think, teaching students in their Indigenous language, especially at a time when the US government was mandating English-only instruction, that was really daring of her. That was progressive. The idea of opening a day school on a reservation at a time when boarding schools were all the rage, that was progressive. But a lot of her other ideas just were not very progressive. They were very, very conservative. And as she grew older, and particularly during the time that she was living in Northampton, I would say in the last few decades of her life, she became even more conservative. There was a time here in Northampton where there was a big effort going on to sort of label movies as bad and to censor them. And Elaine jumped into the fray on that. She did not believe that children should be exposed to the things that they were exposed to in the movies. So, when I first read these things about her out of order, it was very disillusioning. But as I became better read, I think, and a better historian, I started to be able to contextualize that better. So I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Thank you. This was really fascinating. Question about, I guess, the movement from senior thesis to project later on. So it sounded like the initial spark was Elaine's story. How did you, I guess, decide to make the pivot to doing a joint biography and telling the story of this romance and this marriage?
Sure. Well, I made a couple of different pivots. As you could tell from Mari's introduction, a lot of my work has been in social science. I mean, that's the way I was trained. And most of my professional work for many years was about children in media. And those are the classes that I still teach at Tufts. But about 15 or so years ago, a very smart colleague of mine said, Julie, it's about time you started doing the research that is most interesting to you. And I thought, you know what? He's right. And so I decided to return to my early interest in women's history and doing archival research. And I sort of naively thought, I'll write a biography, because I love reading biographies. And I think it was, having read so many biographies of Emily Dickinson, that I decided to take on Mabel Loomis Todd and Millicent Todd Bingham, when I discovered that nobody had written a full-length biography of either one of them, and that they were both fascinating women who had a really interesting, complicated relationship with each other. And there were also 721 boxes of primary source material in the basement of Sterling Library at Yale, where my oldest child had just started college, and I wanted to have a good excuse to go visit. So that's how I became a biographer. And after I did that first biography, the biography bug really bit me. And I decided that's really how I want to be spending my time researching and writing. And so, get back to your the other part of your question about how do you sort of take something that becomes a thesis and enlarge it. I think the original thesis that I wrote at Smith was really focusing on some of the issues that I learned about from the wonderful Peter Rose of assimilation and acculturation, and trying to frame the Eastman story that way. But there was so much more to it, and I knew from my forays into those papers that there was a lot more to tell. And so, when I was looking around, as I said, for the subject of my second biography, I kept finding myself drawn back to that story. I just knew that it was a great story, that it was a dramatic story, that it was in some ways a great, but also a very, very tragic love story. And I also knew that it was an important story to be telling today because of all of the different controversies that we have swirling around in this country about gender, about race, about ethnicity, and about who can become an American, who is legitimately an American. So it's something that Charles Eastman thought about and wrote about a lot in his lifetime. And it just seemed like the right topic for the right time. And I found that going back to these papers after all these years was really exciting thing to do. I just say a word about my sources. So there are a lot of good sources upstairs on Elaine. But what I found out is that she curated what she left to Smith College very, very severely. So that much storied wedding that I told you about, there are no photographs of it. There is almost no mention of Charles Eastman in the papers that are upstairs. Almost none. She got rid of all of them. Charles left almost nothing behind in terms of primary sources. We have his published books, some of his other writings. There are some letters that are at Dartmouth, but not a lot. So to try to piece together their story, I had to read very widely. I had to triangulate. I did go to archives or used archives in 15 different states, 2 Canadian provinces, and the BBC. I was also doing a lot of this work during the pandemic, which turned out to actually to be a great thing because archivists were still working remotely, and they were very, very happy to find things and digitize them. So things that would have taken me a whole lot longer if I had been traveling to all these different archives. And then the other thing that I was able to do for this book was, because the Eastmans were so well known in their own time, there were literally thousands of newspaper articles about them. And so I relied very, very, very heavily on my favorite website, newspapers.com, to look at all of these newly digitized sources, which really helped to fill in a lot of the blanks of the Eastmans' lives.
You just answered the question that I was going to put to you, because to do research on Emily Dickinson and Mabel Todd Loomis, the papers are all there, Amherst, Yale, and a few other places. But this was a double biography involving people who were very well known in their time, but there aren't other biographies. So my question was going to be your research journey, what that looked like, and were there surprising caches of materials that you came across?
There are always great surprises in the archives. And yes, so I would say the greatest surprise in the archives upstairs was that a subsequent gift to Smith College was given by the Dayton family. And Elaine's youngest sister, Rose, was a very good lifelong correspondent. While Elaine destroyed Rose's letters to her, which you can't see upstairs. What you can see are the letters that Elaine wrote to Rose. And Elaine did not know, of course, that Rose's family would save the letters and that they would one day give them to Smith College, which is a huge gift to the world and to storytellers like me, because these letters are probably the most unfiltered source of information that we have about Elaine's thoughts on all sorts of things: her marriage, her children, her relationships with her siblings, her thoughts about her parents, the disappointments that she had in her own life. It's all in those letters to Rose. So that was one of the greatest surprises. Then there were some others. I mean, they have one of the things that was sort of a surprising source for me was the Boy Scout National Museum in Cimarron, New Mexico, which turned out to have some interesting stuff about Charles. But it's really those newspaper clippings that were the gold mine, I think, and the single most important source of information for this book.
Thank you. It's really crazy that this started out as your senior thesis, because I'm doing a special studies that is very much in line kind of with this as a senior. So it's really funny to see how that works out. And so I kind of selfishly have a question that kind of goes along with what I'm studying, I guess. But I was just wondering if, I know you said he doesn't leave a lot in terms of like personal writing or anything. It's very much just his like published work that he leaves behind, that Charles Eastman leaves behind. But do you know if he like writes on anything, or if you can kind of glean anything about sort of what he was feeling in terms of like understanding sort of like the very assimilationist like work he was both a victim of and yet still doing, and his wife was of course doing at the same time?
Yeah, thank you. That is a great question. So the answer is no. He did not leave behind any paper trail or indication of what he was feeling about some of this. So a lot of what I've written in my book is guesswork. And I think, the other thing that is really important to say here, as I do in the book, is that I have to acknowledge my own positionality in this as a white woman, and trying to understand what was going through the head of an Indigenous man who died many, many years before I was born is really hard to do. And so I tried as best as I could to mind that gap. And to mind it both by acknowledging that it exists, but then also by reading everything I could about Indigenous thoughts and philosophies and things that were written by other people who were contemporaries of Charles Eastman, who actually did leave some stuff behind. And also by having conversations with Indigenous scholars, which was a fabulous source for me. So Phil Deloria, who wrote the magnificent foreword to my book, is one of the leading Native American historians of Native American history. And he's a good friend. And I feel so fortunate, because anytime I had a question about Charles Eastman, I'd call him up and say, Phil. And of course, he didn't know either, but he tried to help me as best he could. And it's really hard for us to do this kind of work. And I think we only know what we know, and we have to be honest about what we don't know and try to position ourselves accordingly. But that's a great question, and thank you, and good luck with your work. So, well, thank you all so much for coming. Oh, one more question.
Yeah, hi, thanks for this. My great-grandfather also married a white woman, and it was in the papers in Lebanon. Carlisle graduate makes white woman his bride. So very fascinated by this sort of public perception of these interracial marriages. That was 19 teens. And so I have this question about, you just said you only know what you know. And I'm curious how, as an archivist then, or as a historian, and I should preface this by my training is entirely in poetry and not history. So how you find these, like the surprise in New Mexico where you weren't expecting to find Charles Eastman with the Boy Scouts things, like, is it sort of like a trail of breadcrumbs, you follow one clue to one clue to one clue, or how do you locate something when you are trying to build ways to triangulate without being able to just directly say, like, well, I want Charles Eastman papers, and having to, creatively figure out where they are, like how you locate some of those surprises?
Well, I think you used the key word, which is triangulate, and so, and I really think that's what we have to do. There have been many people who have written about, what's largely known as some of the structural silences of the archives. That most archives, this one not included, I think, was most archives were started by white men and reflect the biases and collecting practices of white men. And of course, many archives have tried to rectify that in the years since, but there's a lot to rectify. And telling the stories of women's lives is really challenging to do all the time, because especially with 19th century women, women papers were not considered to be valuable, and they weren't saved for the most part, even by women themselves. And the stories of people of color, same thing, so you have this double whammy of having things that are not saved or valued by the archives, and then the people themselves and their descendants also don't necessarily think that they should be saved. And I think, what I've seen with women's papers too, is that sometimes women destroy their own papers for very deliberate reasons. They don't want their secrets to be known. So how do we tell those stories? How do we fill in those gaps? We have to triangulate. That's really the only thing that we can do. And then as biographers, I think we have some of these other tools in our toolkit of being able to use things like newspaper.com, which is fantastic, or going to some of the places and trying to see the world as close as you can through your subject eyes. But it's really challenging. And I wish I had a better answer for you about that, but just keep at it. So anyway, thank you all so much for coming. I don't have books with me, but I do have some cards from NYU Press. If you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, you can do so at a 30% discount from NYU. And thanks so much for coming.